Hi. In my last talk on Codex, I covered most of the essential features of the system and gave an overview of its theoretical structure. In this talk, I'm going to be looking at entering a single letter or a single text document. This is a diary entry from a Florentine diary by Luca Landucci, a 15th century apothecary in Florence, practically an exact contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci. He was around during several momentous, tumultuous events in the late 15th century, the attempted assassination of Lorenzo de' Medici, the invasion of Italy by Charles VIII of France, the rise of Savonarola, and he gives us a very interesting window into Renaissance Florence from the point of view of an ordinary citizen, someone who wasn't writing a chronicle, he was just keeping a day-to-day diary. So I'm picking one diary entry, which is really 2 or 3 sentences here, and I'm just going to go through and annotate this as I would any other text that I've done so far, and I'll discuss the salient points. So the first thing I would do is start annotating the stylistic aspects. So in the original text, this is italicized, and given that it's italicized, I believe it would be the intention of the editor to signify that this is foreign language text. So I'm going to annotate that with Italian. And that's pretty much where I would start in the first version. Every time you save a copy of a document, it's versioned in the system. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to put in the stylistic annotations. I'm going to put in the date of the diary entry. I'm going to note the page number, 130, and I'm going to save it. Now we'll open that up again, and we'll look at adding some more meaningful annotations. One thing that we could annotate straight away is we have a date, and we have a couple of options here, a couple of date-related annotations. This is a Codex-specific one called time, and we have a number of TEI annotations we can use as well. So I'm going to, because we have an overlapping multi-dimensional editor, I'm going to annotate both of them. So first I'll set the TEI annotation, then I'll set the when property to 1498, 02, 15. If we mouse over that, we can see that's now been set. And then I'll set the Codex property as well. This creates a node in the Codex Neo4j database, which can be used to quickly identify other texts on with the same date. Now the next thing we could do, we could either go through and we could annotate all of the entities mentioned. Now in Codex, that term entity is represented by the term agent, which is the first annotation here. So this is an agent is any entity that's a person, a place, an object. It can be an event, it can really be anything that's practically a noun in the system. So I would normally annotate this in 2 phases. The first thing I would do would be to annotate the agents, and then I would look at annotating any pronouns that are there as well, which can reuse those agents that I've already annotated. If it's a short text, I might just annotate it directly, but given that this is a demo, we might actually try out the name entity recognition feature. So I'll click that button. Now this makes a call to Google's natural language processing API, and it's come back and identify what it believes are the nouns in the system, proper and common nouns. So it hasn't identified who these entities are. That is an option in the API. It will return Wikipedia URLs, but given that these texts often mention people who aren't in the Wikipedia records, I've simply told it to come back and identify what parts of the text are proper and common nouns. So I'm going to just click Fra Girolamo. This initiates a search of the Codex database for any entities with that phrase in the name. And this may look a little bit odd at first to someone who might be expecting to see people in the system. We have quite a grab bag of entities. We have an epistle by Fra Girolamo, an excommunication of Fra Girolamo, which I've called an event here. We have certain unscrupulous enemies of Girolamo. We finally have Girolamo himself, and this list goes on a little bit further. So that's something that's already perhaps a little bit different from a normal annotation system, that the kind of entities that we're annotating aren't always just people or even organizations. They can be more abstract entities. So I could click select to nominate this person, or if I was having trouble finding Fra Girolamo from amongst all the entities that are related to him in some way, I could click this button here, which is the aliases button, and this will find any entities where Fra Girolamo, where they're mentioned by that phrase in the text itself. In this case, I'll just click select. Once I've done that, that red line turns grey, which means it's been assigned, and I can clear that, search for that again, and so on. If there were several repetitions of that phrase, I could click this find and replace button, and every version of Fra Girolamo in red would become grey and would be assigned to the same ID. Now I'll move on to the next one, San Marco. Again, we have quite a few entities related to San Marco. I'll click the aliases button, and this one is quite useful. We find fairly quickly the distinct entity, so I'll click select. Now we get onto some other, well, once I do Pisa, we get onto some other kinds of entities which are perhaps not quite the usual agents that would be annotated, because we're looking at here not a person, a distinct person, or a building, or a city. We're now looking at things like sort of anonymous entities like priests and monks. And when we move on to looking at pronouns, we're going to think about, well, what does them signify here? How would we connect that to an entity in the system? What does one signify here? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to annotate priests and monks, because they will be referred to in the them section to come. So what does that mean in this context? So Fra Girolamo preached in San Marco, only wishing for the attendance of priests and monks. Well, this raises the questions of which priests and monks. You could say that this means priests and monks universally, but does that mean in any time period? He's thinking of priests and monks at that time, probably on that day, at that time of day for that particular sermon. He's probably maybe even thinking of priests and monks in his own order of San Marco. Or it could be all priests and monks in Florence. This would be something that could be tricky to decide at this phase of annotation. It might require more research, but we would like to we would like to nominate this in some way, and so to come back to this later. So we might say, Fra Girolamo preached in San Marco only wishing for the attendance of priests and monks. So we could perhaps qualify this a bit. So we have a general collective term here, the priests in Florence, but let's make this more specific to the text. So let's create a new agent, and we'll say priests that Fra Girolamo wished to attend his sermon. So this doesn't perhaps tell us more specifically who they were, but it gives us a very clear idea of the entity with respect to this particular text. So these priests will be male, and there'll be a collective, and to further qualify this, we don't have to assign a section, and in fact section's completely optional. It doesn't necessarily determine anything, but it can be useful if you're quickly looking for agents in your entire system. You may have several projects. You may have the story of Landucci, Michelangelo's letters. You might have text from a completely different time period, and you have agents for each of them. Some of them may have similar names. It's useful perhaps to tag them in some way and say, well, this agent is part of this section. So I'm going to say it's part of the Luca Landucci diary section. I'm going to hit save. And I think we have a similar approach we could take with monks here. Monks that Girolamo wished to attend his sermon. Again, male, collective, Luca Landucci. Now we do have these other two sections here. Do we wish to treat them as a distinct entity? In some circumstances you might. I would argue probably in this diary entry that it might be something we could skip by at this point, but we could return and think about whether that would be a distinct entity, attendance and defects. I think the emphasis here is more on Fra Girolamo, the priests and the monks themselves, rather than attendance as a noun, or defects as a noun. Or perhaps we might come back to defects though. Now we have Landucci saying that he received this news according to what was reported to me by one of them. So one is one of what? One of the priests, one of the monks, one of both, one of either. So let's keep this fairly fluid. So one of the monks and priests who Fra Girolamo wished to attend the sermon who talked to Landucci. So we know by implication that a monk or a priest at this point in time is going to be male, so we'll say it's a male person. Landucci, done. During these days, the war with Pisa was less active on account of the hard winter. It's interesting it hasn't picked up winter. Now that's something that might be worth annotating, but let's just... I don't know what the name of this particular war was, or whether it was a war in the technical sense, whether it was a skirmish, siege. I'm not expert enough in Italian Florentine history to tell at a glance. So maybe perhaps we'll grab this section here and we'll give it, create an entity for it. We can come back and look at this later, and we'll maybe scope this in some way. We'll say, well, the war with Pisa, 1498, February. We don't quite know. I don't know anything more about that at this point, and we may find that the date is irrelevant. There's an actual name we can use. So again, I'll put Landucci there. Now, I'm going to accept these nominations at this point, and we click the button, and we see only the ones that are accepted come back and are highlighted in red. Now, just to be safe, we'll save this document, and we can see if we pop over to the Versions tab that we've just created the second version. We can pop back to the first version, just the styling. We can go back to, and we can continue with our editing. So the next thing I would probably look at, once I've identified who the concrete agents are, I would want to start filling in the pronouns. So I'll hit the Pronouns button, and we have a few that we might need to fill in. So we'll start with he. So there's a he in this case is for Girolamo himself. Now I've got this tab here called Inline, which is populated with any agents who exist in the current document. Now you can still search the entire system. You can look for recently used ones, you can create brand new ones on the fly, but this is a useful tab to start with when you're populating pronouns, because the likelihood is that the pronoun in the text is going to refer to someone who's been named in the text in some way. So we can see in this case that he referred to Girolamo Savonarola. Now we'll also notice here that we have an entity. We have two entities here that we haven't actually created. We'll create them in a second. So we'll see me is Landucci himself, who wasn't named. So he wasn't named in the text, so we're going to have to search for him. And we're going to choose Luca Landucci. And we have them, there, and them. We're going to have to, let's accept this. Let's save it. Let's now look at setting these third person pronouns. So who is them in this instance? So it's both it's both the priests and the monks. So let's create this joint entity. Priests and monks who Girolamo wished to attend his sermon. We know they're male, we know they're a collective, we know that's part of Luca Landucci. Now, to force that one to appear in the Inline tab, I'm going to reload that. We're going to do, now it'll appear in this section here, so the collective, the priests and monks, so let's select that. Let's select them again. And I'm going to not annotate that at this point. It's perhaps a little bit of a nebulous concept that doesn't connect likely to any other text, but we could annotate, you know, what refers to here. So let's just click accept. So now we have named entities, places, events, pronouns annotated. And we could go a bit further, but I'm going to stop at this point because this is perhaps the most useful information that we have so far. I'm going to save that. And then I think I'm going to start looking at a couple of other features. So the first thing I might do, once I've annotated the text to my satisfaction, and I don't think there's any textual changes necessary, I'm going to click the Generate Syntax button. That button does a call to the Google NLP API, brings back a syntax tree, converts that into standoff properties, and saves them to Neo4j and connects them to the text. So now we can click any of these parts of speech tokens, and we can highlight the relevant section. We can also generate sentiment analysis. This is really more for fun. It's just what the Google API thinks the text is about. In many cases, it's not at all accurate according to how a human being might interpret the text. But it doesn't cost us anything, and it's kind of interesting to have that information. So if we look at the agent screen, we can now see a breakdown of who and what is mentioned in this text. And if we think about the named entities that were in the text, Fra Girolamo, San Marco, Pisa, these are the typical entities that would be annotated, I think, in most texts. But now if we look at the Agents tab, we actually find the most referenced entity is this collective, the priests and monks who Fra Girolamo wished to attend his sermon. So in one sense, this could be considered the subject of this diary entry. Something that we would like to do next, I think, is to look at, well, we have this collective entity, but how do we get from this collective back to the constituent parts? How do we get from the priests and monks to the priests and to the monks? So what we would do is we click this agent here. We would go to the Relations tab, and we're going to establish a relationship. So we're going to go to Quick Add, and I'm just going to grab this section of text, and we're going to establish a relationship. So we're going to say what the relationship is going to be is one of a kind of membership. So let's check this list and find the appropriate one. So I believe in my system I call it a collection. So we can think of the priests and monks as being a collection which contains items, being the priests and the monks. So we're going to say that the priests and monks is the dominant partner, the collection, and the part, the subordinate one, is, and we'll start with perhaps, let's just start with the priests perhaps. Priests that Fra Girolamo wished to attend his sermon. Okay. Now, we do in fact have a date associated with this. We don't need to. The date would be affiliated with the relationship itself, and we could say that they are part of this collection at a certain point in time. But we could leave that for the moment because it may not be appropriate to do that. So let's just click Save. Now we can see that the priests and monks is a collection with a part containing priests. So now I'm going to add the monks to that collection. Now I've left these pre-filled, so all we have to do now is find the second part. Now if we don't see what we want, if we're struggling to find the term, we could look for monks, and that will probably find what we need to link to. We could also try recently used, and because it was created not that long ago, it turns up here, fourth on the list. I'm going to select that. So now we have the priests and the monks who now link back to this collective, or what we call a sort of constellation entity, because they kind of points in a constellation. Now we can see that we can see how it's referenced in the text. Let's pop back to the text. Now I believe there's one more entity that we want to link in some way. So we've got, what is this one here? So the one is one of the priests and monks who Fra Girolamo wished to attend his sermon, who talked to Landucci. So this is an interesting kind of relationship. What would this be? It's one of composition. They are one of the collective. So you could say that they are part of that collective, but we had already defined monks as being a part of monks and priests as being a part of monks and priests. Would this one be the same kind of relationship? it's also one, to an extent, of anonymity. We don't know who the one is. It could be a monk or a priest. I think we need to reflect that in some way, but for now we might assume it's the same kind of relationship as the previous one. So let's just, because we can always change it if it doesn't work out, so we can choose the pre-existing selection. We would say that the priests and monks again is the collection. We would then have one. Now this, I worry that this is not strictly correct, but this is something we can start with at least that's still connected in some way. So let's go back to the collection. We can see now we have a collection with 3 parts. And we've got the monks, we've got the priests, and we've got one of the monks and priests. So although the ability to automatically search the system, this collective entity, and find anything connected to its constituents, that feature hasn't yet been built in as a tab to show all 3 results together. The relationship is encoded in the system, and it's there for us to come back to, especially when I build a tab that gives us the ability to query across all of these entities. And that should be fairly straightforward. Let's pop back to the text. Now let's look at this again. We'll review it one last time. We've done the date. We've named all the proper nouns. We've named all the created the pronouns, linked them, and defined their constituent parts. I would say there's probably one more thing we might want to do when we've done the English syntax. Well, we potentially have some Italian syntax here. So we have a few words. For a start, we have an italicized word which the editor wants us to understand, in my opinion, as being Italian text. Not every Italian place name is italicized. It doesn't seem to be consistent. Now we did mark this up as being Italian, but we can also make use of the Google NLP API again. But rather than run it across the entire text, we're going to run it across this range of text. And I would also do it for Fra Girolamo, because the Fra, I believe, is an Italian honorific. And might be tempted to do it for Pisa, but let's say we left it for now. Click Save. Now we notice we've got Lang English. Now the English did pick up these other terms. That's because the Google NLP API was working on the assumption that the text is English, and even if it doesn't understand or recognize Italian terms, it's still going to treat them as being English words, but it might mark them up in other, give them a part of speech token that indicates it can't place that in some form. So perhaps that's a part of that, but we can also see that the ones that we marked as Italian will also come up as well. So I think this might be a good place to stop if there's nothing else that we want to document. One other thing we might want to document at this stage is to think about, are there any statements made? I mean, we certainly have an event here. Perhaps we will document that he preached in San Marco. It would be more difficult or more challenging to document the wishing part of that. Would the wish be a separate event? We have another action here. He told them of their defects. That could be something else that would be interesting to document. We could imagine wanting to see this in a timeline, that he berated them. We have other events here. We have that Landucci was informed by somebody, one of them, of what Girolamo said. We don't know necessarily when that took place. We know that he says this is on the 15th of February. Sometimes these dates don't correspond to when he's actually keeping the record. For example, during these days, the war with Pisa was less active. What days? Is the last few days? Is it the last week, last month? Is it the last year? So it's obviously winter. It's perhaps the duration of winter. We don't necessarily know what this covers, and we might be in some doubt about when this was actually written. So I think we will pop back into this and we will create an event, which is the event icon here. So we have, for an event, we have a subject, we have an object, and we have a bunch of other I was going to say predicates, but perhaps participles that we can choose from. We have dates and so on. We have an authority. So let's start with Fra Girolamo, who's not mentioned there, but I have a bug with that JavaScript. Let's find Fra Girolamo. Now we'll have to look for a trait or an action or a quality. Now I think preached would be in the system already in some form, so that's an event. We saw he preached in San Marco. We could probably say at San Marco. According to Landucci, because we're getting it from his diary. We know it's fairly clear that from the context of the diary entry that it took place on the dated day. So if Fra Girolamo preached at San Marco, he's not doing, this is a fairly atomic event, doesn't really seem to involve anyone else at this level. So I think we would hit save. So we now have an event using the old terminology claim. So we also have this might be interesting, and this might be interesting to document. I think we might stop there, as that's a fairly clear event, and these are perhaps more nebulous to define. We always come back and attack them later. Now if we click the Statements tab, we can see the statement we just created has been linked to the text, and we can see it's a little bit Byzantine to read it, but we can see that according to Landucci, Fra Girolamo Savonarola preached at San Marco. So if we now went to San Marco, we would see, and we can pop into the actual event entity, we could pop into San Marco, and we can see anything that's relating to San Marco, and we can see the event reflected here. We could also pop into, we could go by type, but that's not yet linked to the statements. You can see the text where this statement came from, so we can trace back every statement to every text. I think that's where I would probably normally stop with annotating this diary entry, and so that's where I will leave it tonight.